On a crisp Tuesday afternoon in Old Town Alexandria, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I'm Deanna Sterling, 36 years old, and for the past decade I've made a career out of assessing risks for one of the largest insurance firms in Virginia. I'm used to spotting disasters before they happen, but I never expected the biggest red flag to come from my own family's group chat. I'm getting married tomorrow. I've withdrawn all your savings and sold the apartment in your name. The message flashed on my screen like a live grenade. My younger brother had just announced the theft of my life's work with the casual tone of someone borrowing a tie. Immediately, my mother chimed in. "You live alone anyway, Deanna. Just consider it a wedding gift for your brother. Don't ruin his big day." My father said nothing. He simply flooded the chat with heart emojis endorsing the betrayal. Sitting in the heavy silence of the library, I stared at the photo of the property he had triumphantly posted. Rhys, my overindulged, entitled younger brother, thought he had just executed a brilliant financial coup. But through the eyes of a risk analyst, I saw his fatal mistake instantly. He was too rushed, too greedy to realize he had just signed his own warrant. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply sent a single cold smiley face emoji into the group chat. Rhys has no idea that the apartment doesn't actually belong to me in the way he thinks it does. And this betrayal is about to carry a price tag far steeper than anyone in my family ever imagined. Before I reveal the shocking truth behind that property and how I brought my family's secrets into the light, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications right now. You won't want to miss how a risk analyst handles a villain right at the altar. 6 months before that explosive group chat message, my world had been reduced to the rhythmic wheezing of a ventilator and the sterile scent of antiseptic. It was late September on the George Washington Memorial Parkway when a distracted driver in a heavy SUV crossed the median, slamming head-on into my sedan. The impact was a symphony of grinding metal and shattering glass that left me broken both physically and mentally. For the first week in the intensive care unit at Innova Alexandria Hospital, I existed in a haze of semi-consciousness, my brain swimming in a potent cocktail of intravenous opioids and surgical anesthesia. Pain was the only constant, a dull throb that pulsed in time with the flickering fluorescent lights above my bed. It was during this period of absolute vulnerability that Rhys Sterling first appeared at my bedside, wearing a mask of fraternal devotion that fooled everyone, including the nursing staff. I remember the sensation of his hand on my shoulder, a touch that felt oddly heavy through the fog of fentanyl. Rhys was 28, unemployed, and had spent the better part of a decade leaning on our parents for every cent. Yet here he was, suddenly playing the role of the attentive guardian. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee, and something sharper perhaps, the scent of desperation. "Deanna, I need you to focus for a second." He whispered, his voice smooth and urgent. "The hospital administration is breathing down our necks. They need someone to authorize the next round of surgeries and handle the insurance claims while you're out of it. Beau and me are too overwhelmed to deal with the paperwork. I've got it all ready for you." I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. I could only offer a weak, confused nod. My mind, usually sharp enough to dismantle complex insurance fraud schemes, was currently unable to process a simple sentence. Rhys pulled a thick stack of legal documents from a manila folder, flipping through pages with a practiced, hurried efficiency. He didn't read them aloud. He just pointed to the signature lines highlighted with yellow translucent tabs. "It's just a standard medical and financial proxy, Deanna. It's temporary, just to keep the collectors away while you recover. Trust me." He placed a heavy, cold fountain pen in my trembling hand. I felt his fingers guide mine, steadying the pen as I scrawled my name across several pages. Each signature felt like an immense physical labor, a blurred line of ink that looked nothing like my usual firm professional script. What my drug-addled brain failed to recognize was that I wasn't signing a mere medical release or a temporary insurance form. Hidden beneath the jargon and the deceptive reassurance was a durable power of attorney. In the state of Virginia, that document is effectively a master key. It granted Rhys the unilateral right to access my bank accounts, liquidate my investments, and most crucially act as my legal representative in all real estate transactions without further notice or consent. He had waited until I was at my lowest, until the professional risk analyst in me was silenced by trauma to strip me of my autonomy. As I drifted back into a drug-induced slumber, I saw Rhys tucking the papers back into his folder, a look of grim satisfaction crossing his face that I wouldn't understand until it was far too late. He didn't stay to hold my hand after the papers were signed. He disappeared into the hospital hallway, leaving me alone with the steady, mocking beep of the heart monitor. The quiet hum of my home office in Old Town Alexandria felt suffocating as I stared at the dual monitors, my fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. In my profession as a risk analyst, emotions are liabilities. Only data provides the truth. I needed to distance myself from the stinging betrayal of the family group chat and look at my life as if it were a failing insurance claim. I logged into my primary savings account with a heavy heart, but my hands remained steady. When the balance finally loaded, the air left my lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. $140,000, the accumulation of 15 years of disciplined saving, late-night audits, and bypassed vacations, had been decimated. The current balance stood at a mocking $412. I immediately navigated to the transaction history, my eyes scanning the digital entries with predatory focus. The hemorrhage had started precisely 3 weeks after I was discharged from the hospital. Under the authority of the durable power of attorney I had unwittingly signed in my drug-induced haze, Rhys Sterling had initiated a series of sophisticated wire transfers. On October 14th, $40,000 was sent to an offshore betting platform. On October 22nd, another $60,000 vanished into a luxury car dealership. The remaining $40,000 had been drained in smaller, erratic increments, high-end caterers, floral designers, and a deposit for a venue at a 5-star hotel in Arlington. Every penny of my recovery fund was being used to subsidize a wedding I wasn't even invited to until the very last second. A cold, calculated anger began to replace the initial shock. I didn't call him. I didn't scream into the void. Instead, I accessed the Virginia Department of Professional and Occupational Regulations online portal. I needed to see exactly how far Rhys had gone with that master key I had given him. My professional training taught me that greed rarely stops at liquid assets. It always seeks the stability of real estate. I cross-referenced my name and the power of attorney filing against the local land records. My heart hammered against my ribs as I saw that Rhys had pulled my digital property files twice in the last month. He wasn't just looking, he was preparing a sale. The digital paper trail grew more complex as I dug deeper into the public registry. I noticed that he had accessed not only my personal residence files, but also the corporate archives associated with my family name. My fingers flew across the keys, bypassing the basic security layers I had set up years ago. I found a digital folder labeled Urgent Closing Documents that had been uploaded to a shared cloud drive used by our parents. Inside, I found a scanned contract of sale, but the property address listed wasn't for my high-rise condo in Arlington. It was for the historic brick house on Jefferson Street, the very roof currently over our parents' heads. As a risk analyst, I began to see the fatal flaw in his frantic, amateurish scheme. Rhys had clearly performed a keyword search for Sterling and property title and grabbed the first official-looking deed he found. He had bypassed the nuance of ownership structures in his rush to secure more cash for Melanie's extravagant demands. My eyes narrowed as I clicked on the final document in the queue, a digital file marked as pending authorization. It was a formal deed transfer involving a buyer's agent and a title company. The bold letters at the top of the screen sent a chill down my spine. Final closing statement. asset transfer relating to Sterling Trust LLC. The trap was set, but Rhys was the one who had unknowingly stepped into it. The iron gate of the Jefferson Street estate creaked with a familiar, mournful groan as I pushed it open. This red brick federal-style house had always been the crown jewel of our family's history, standing as a symbol of the wealth our grandfather had meticulously built. As I stepped onto the porch, the muffled sounds of laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes drifted through the heavy oak door. I didn't knock. I walked straight into the foyer where the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the unmistakable aura of unearned victory. There in the center of the living room stood Rhys Sterling, looking every bit the triumphant heir in a tailored suit that my stolen savings had undoubtedly paid for. Melanie Vance was draped over his arm, her eyes scanning the room with a hunger that confirmed every suspicion I held. "Deanna, you finally decided to join the celebration," Rhys called out, his voice dripping with a mix of condescension and false warmth. He didn't wait for a response before turning back to our parents, who were beamed at him like he had just conquered the world. "I was just telling Mom and Dad about the real estate deal. I managed to close the sale on your Arlington property this afternoon. $380,000 cash. The buyers are eager to move in by the end of next month. It's perfect timing for the honeymoon in Saint-Tropez." My mother stepped forward, her hand resting gently on Rhys's sleeve. "You see, Deanna, Rhys is finally taking initiative. He's securing his future. You should be proud that your assets are finally serving a greater family purpose." I stood by the fireplace, my coat still on, watching them with the detached precision of a risk analyst observing a catastrophic structural failure. I didn't yell. I didn't mention the $140,000 missing from my bank account or the forged power of attorney. I simply looked at the documents Rhys had scattered across the mahogany coffee table, the closing statements he was so proud of. As I glanced at the legal descriptions and the entity names, a wave of icy clarity washed over me. Rhys had spent his entire life being too lazy to read the fine print, and that arrogance had finally led him into an abyss. He thought he had sold my private condominium in Arlington under the name Deanna Sterling Holdings. However, the deed he had actually signed over belonged to Sterling Trust LLC, the legal entity that owned the very house we were currently standing in. The sheer scale of his incompetence was breathtaking. In his haste to liquidate my life, he had grabbed the wrong file from our grandfather's old cabinet, blinded by the word Sterling and the high appraisal value. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had unwittingly sold our parents' primary residence to a third-party investment firm using a fraudulent power of attorney that gave him no legal authority over the trust. I looked at my parents, who were currently toasted to the man who had just made them homeless, and felt a profound sense of estrangement. They had enabled his greed for 28 years, and now the monster they created was about to devour them along with himself. "Is there a problem, Deanna? You look remarkably quiet," Melanie chimed in, her voice sharp as a razor. "I hope you're not going to be difficult about the furniture. The contract includes the fixtures." I looked her directly in the eyes, seeing the desperation hidden beneath her designer makeup. She was counting on this money to stay ahead of her own shadows, and she had no idea the check she was holding was written in disappearing ink. "No problem at all," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "I just came to see the house one last time before the wedding. I've seen everything I need to see now." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the house. I could hear Rhys laughing behind me, telling my father that I was just jealous of his business acumen. Let him laugh. Let him believe he had outsmarted the sister who spent her life calculating the cost of failure. As I reached my car and looked back at the glowing windows of the red brick house, I knew the clock was ticking. The buyers would arrive. The title company would eventually run the final audit, and the Sterling Trust would be flagged. But by then, I wouldn't be the one pleading for mercy. I was done being the family's safety net. It was time to let the law do what I could never bring myself to do: break them. The drive to Hartford was a blur of gray asphalt and skeletal trees, providing the perfect backdrop for the icy resolve forming in my chest. I chose to meet at the Connecticut State Library, a place where history was etched in stone, and every word was bound by law. It was the only place quiet enough to witness the dismantling of my family's deception. Waiting for me in a secluded alcove of the reading room was Mr. Harrison Thorne. At 70 years old, he remained as sharp as the legal quills he used to favor his eyes, twinkling with a mix of warmth and professional steel. He had been my grandfather's closest confidant and the architect of the Sterling estate's complex legal fortifications. As I sat down across from him, the smell of aged parchment and leather bindings seemed to ground me. Deanna, I watched the digital alerts on the Sterling Trust LLC account yesterday. Harrison Thorne began, his voice a low, resonant rumble that commanded attention. He pushed a heavy cream-colored folder toward me, his expression grave. I assume the unauthorized pending deed transfer for the Alexandria property is why you've traveled all this way. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the original trust documents that my father and Rhys had never been allowed to see. My grandfather, a man of immense foresight, had known that his son was a spendthrift and his grandson was a shadow of a man. To protect the family's legacy, he had bypassed an entire generation. The documents are clear, Deanna, Harrison said, tapping a specific clause highlighted in the original will. Your grandfather appointed you as the sole trustee of the Sterling Trust LLC. You are the only individual with the legal authority to encumber, sell, or transfer any asset held within that entity. Your parents were granted a lifetime residence clause, a privilege of occupancy, not a right of ownership. The moment Rhys Sterling attempted to sell that house using a fraudulent power of attorney, he didn't just steal from you, he committed a direct assault on the trust itself. He leaned back, his fingers steepled. In the eyes of the Commonwealth of Virginia and federal banking laws, this is a clear-cut case of real estate fraud and grand larceny. I looked at the signature page, seeing my own name listed as the ultimate authority over the very roof my parents were currently using to host Rhys's pre-wedding celebrations. The irony was as sharp as a blade. Rhys had spent weeks sifting through my files, but he had never bothered to check the foundational documents held by Harrison Thorne. He had operated on the arrogant assumption that Sterling was a singular pot of money he could dip into whenever he pleased. By selling the trust's property, he had triggered a cascade of legal tripwires that were now impossible to reset. The buyer's money was currently sitting in an escrow account that would never be released to him, and the title company was already flagging the inconsistencies. What is the next step, Harrison? I asked, my voice devoid of the hesitation that had plagued me in the hospital bed 6 months ago. The lawyer reached into his briefcase and pulled out a series of pre-drafted affidavits and a formal criminal complaint addressed to the Financial Crimes Unit. We file this immediately, he replied firmly. Rhys has attempted to sell a multi-million-dollar asset he does not own, using a power of attorney that was never intended to cover fiduciary trust assets. We also include the bank statements showing the $140,000 he drained from your personal accounts. This isn't just a family dispute anymore, Deanna. This is a criminal investigation. Once I submit these to the authorities and the title company, Rhys's world will stop turning. I picked up the pen, the same professional instrument I used for my risk assessments, and signed the affidavits. Every stroke of the ink felt like a brick being placed in a wall that would forever separate me from the people who had betrayed me. We spent the next 3 hours meticulously cataloging every digital footprint Rhys had left, from his unauthorized logins to the fraudulent emails he sent to the buyer's agent. By the time we finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the library in a state of solemn shadows. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the trustee, and I was about to exercise the full weight of the authority my grandfather had entrusted to me. As I walked out into the cold evening air, I knew that while Rhys was busy planning a grand entrance for his wedding, I had just finished planning his exit from the free world. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in Arlington was a masterpiece of superficial opulence, draped in thousands of white orchids and illuminated by the warm glow of custom crystal chandeliers. I stood at the back of the hall, wearing a simple black dress that felt like a shroud amidst the sea of champagne-colored silk and expensive tuxedos. 6 months of calculated betrayal had led to this moment, a $75,000 wedding paid for, with the life savings Rhys had bled from my accounts. Up at the altar, Rhys Sterling looked radiant, his smile wide and oblivious as he took the hands of Melanie Vance. Melanie was a vision in a designer gown that sparkled under the spotlights, but to my eyes, she looked like a predator finally closing in on her kill. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the hushed anticipation of the I-dos. Just as the officiant began the traditional opening, the heavy mahogany doors behind me swung open with a synchronized thud. I didn't enter alone. Flanking me was Detective Vance Miller from the Financial Crimes Unit, accompanied by 3 uniformed officers, whose presence immediately drained the color from the room. The music faltered into a dissonant silence. I walked down the center aisle, the sound of my heels on the marble floor echoing like the steady ticking of a countdown clock. Guests turned in their seats, their whispers rising like a swarm of disturbed hornets. Rhys froze at the altar, his face shifting from confusion to a sickly pale shade of terror. "Deanna, what the hell are you doing?" Rhys shouted, his voice cracking as he tried to maintain a shred of dignity. "This is my wedding. Get out." My mother rushed forward, her face contorted with indignation. "Deanna Beatrice Sterling, have you lost your mind? You're ruining your brother's life." I ignored her, my focus entirely on the couple at the altar. I stopped just a few feet from them and looked directly at Melanie, whose grip on Rhys's hand had turned white-knuckled. "The party is over, Rhys," I said, my voice projecting clearly to every corner of the ballroom. "And Melanie, I think your creditors from Las Vegas would be very interested to know you're trying to start a new life on stolen equity." Detective Vance Miller stepped forward, pulling a thick envelope from his inner pocket. "Rhys Sterling, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and document forgery," he announced, his voice booming with the authority of the law. "The power of attorney you used to liquidate the Sterling Trust LLC asset was obtained through fraudulent means and exercised without fiduciary authority." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Melanie tried to pull away her eyes, darting toward the side exit, but an officer was already there. "And as for you, Ms. Vance," the detective continued, "we have a civil warrant for your involvement in the inducement of these crimes to satisfy outstanding gambling debts exceeding $200,000. The twist hit Rhys like a physical blow. He turned to Melanie, his mouth agape. "Gambling debts. What is he talking about? You said your family was funding our startup." Melanie's mask of elegance shattered, revealing a cold, sneering opportunism. "You idiot!" she hissed, her voice loud enough for the front row to hear. "I only needed you for the closing check on that Alexandria house. You were supposed to be the rich heir, not a clumsy thief who couldn't even read a property deed." The realization that he had been played by the woman he stole from his own sister for was the final nail in the coffin. As the officers moved in, the ballroom erupted into chaos. My father stepped toward me, his hands shaking. "Deanna, please, we can settle this. Don't let them take him." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the decades of enabling that had led to this catastrophe. "You already settled this, Dad," I replied quietly, "when you told me to consider my life's work a wedding gift for a criminal." Detective Miller clicked the handcuffs into place around Rhys's wrists, the metallic sound final and cold. Simultaneously, a representative from the bank stepped forward to inform my parents that all accounts associated with the Sterling name, including the wedding fund and the escrow from the fraudulent sale, were now under a federal freeze. The orchids, the champagne, the designer gown, it was all evidence now. As they led my brother away in front of his prestigious guests, I didn't feel a surge of joy. I only felt the heavy, quiet satisfaction of a risk finally being mitigated. The aftermath of the chaos at the Ritz-Carlton unfolded with the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of the Virginia judicial system. 4 months later, the sentencing hearing at the Alexandria City Courthouse served as the final curtain call for Rhys Sterling's delusions of grandeur. I sat in the back row of the gallery watching as my brother was escorted into the room, no longer wearing a tailored tuxedo, but a rough orange jumpsuit that highlighted his diminished stature. The evidence against him was an insurmountable mountain, the forged, durable power of attorney, the digital breadcrumbs of $140,000 drained from my accounts, and the fraudulent deed transfer for the Sterling Trust asset. The judge, a woman known for her zero-tolerance stance on elder and family financial abuse, showed no mercy. Rhys was sentenced to 5 years in state prison for federal-level fraud and identity theft, followed by a decade of supervised probation and a mandatory restitution order that he would likely never be able to satisfy. Melanie Vance, the woman who had fueled his descent, had vanished into the shadows of the underground gambling world long before the first gavel struck. She left Rhys with nothing but a mountain of legal fees and the bitter realization that he was merely a pawn in someone else's desperate game. But for me, the most painful verdict wasn't the one handed down to my brother. It was the one I had to execute against my own parents. As the sole trustee of the Sterling Trust LLC, I held the legal obligation to protect the estate from further encumbrance. Because my parents had willfully provided Rhys with the sensitive documents and keys required to facilitate the fraud, they had fundamentally violated the terms of the lifetime residence clause my grandfather had established. A week after the sentencing, I stood on the sidewalk of Jefferson Street, watching as a professional moving crew carried the last of the mahogany furniture out of the red brick house. My parents stood by their car, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and a lingering toxic indignation. "How could you do this? Deanna?" My mother hissed, her voice trembling as she clutched a small box of photos. "We are your parents. You're making us homeless for the sake of a bank account." I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I felt no guilt, only a profound, hollow clarity. "I didn't make you homeless, Mom," I replied, my voice steady like a final audit report. "You chose to trade your security for Rhys's lies. You chose to sacrifice my life's work to fund a fantasy. I am simply closing the books on a liability I can no longer afford to carry." I had arranged for them to move into a modest one-bedroom apartment in a senior living community, a far cry from the historic estate they had taken for granted. It was a safe place, but it was a place of consequences. As their car pulled away, I felt a massive weight lift from my shoulders, replaced by the quiet, somber peace of a job finally completed. I didn't leave them with a phone number or a forwarding address. I had already filed the paperwork to sell the Jefferson Street property. The Sterling legacy as a physical entity was being liquidated. I was moving to a different state, changing my contact information, and rebuilding my life on a foundation that didn't include the people who viewed my success as their personal piggy bank. This journey taught me a brutal but necessary lesson about the intersection of blood and the law. In the United States, we are raised on the ideal that family is an unconditional sanctuary, but the reality is that family can also be the most dangerous source of professional and personal risk. Love without boundaries is not love, it is enabling. Protecting yourself from the toxicity of your own relatives is not an act of betrayal, it is an act of survival. I realized that my grandfather hadn't made me the trustee because he wanted me to be a servant to the family. He made me the trustee because he knew I was the only one with the strength to say no when the truth demanded it. As I watched the sun set over the Potomac River for the last time, I thought about the professional risk analyst I used to be. I was still that person, but I was wiser now. I understood that some bridges are meant to be burned to prevent the fire from spreading to your own home. Real peace doesn't come from a hollow reconciliation or a forced apology from people who aren't truly sorry. It comes from the courage to demand accountability and the wisdom to walk away when the cost of staying becomes too high. Justice is not about revenge. It is about protecting what is right, even when it hurts, and ensuring that the truth remains the final entry in the ledger of your life.